Our focus story today is called The Story of Ruby Bridges. This is a true story of a little girl that grew up during the time when people were not treated fairly. They were treated based on the color of their skin or where they were from. And it was a hard time, and people were not kind. And this little girl, Ruby Bridges, was brave. She was courageous. And I want you to really listen to the things that this little girl did at a very young age. So we celebrate Ruby Bridges and her remarkable life as a young girl. And then she grew up to be a wonderful woman that advocated for others that there would no longer be segregation. And segregation means separation of people based on their race. So this is the true story of a little girl named Ruby Bridges. Okay, and as you can see here in the title page, the story of Ruby Bridges, this is where Ruby grew up on a farm. And there's Ruby when she was a little girl. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylerton, Mississippi. We were very, very, very poor, Ruby said, and my daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think. So she's from the South. She had a little bit of an accent, and they had to move when she was 4. In 1957, so this was a long time ago, even before I was born, and you know Mrs. Stenson is old, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day, and after they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank at night. And every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit, Ruby's mother said, and we wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. So Ruby grew up in a Christian home where God was the center of their life, and they lived their faith out very strongly. Now, boys and girls, at that time, black and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children, and it wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's law. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 little black girls, and you can tell they're about in first grade, to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls went to one school, and 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to first grade in William Frantz Elementary School. So 3 got to go together to one school, and Ruby had to go by herself to the other. Oh, Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. We sat there and prayed to God, Ruby's mother said, that we'd all be strong and we'd have courage and we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl, and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard. Again, a strong Christian family that relied on God for strength and direction. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the school. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some wanted to hurt her. The city and the state police did not help Ruby. But the President of the United States ordered federal marshals, so those are higher up policemen right here, to walk Ruby into the school building, and the marshals carried guns. So imagine being in first grade at 6 years old, walking to school with 2 armed people guiding you in, because these people here, these white people, want to hurt you, and they're screaming at you and they're calling you names. Your mom and dad probably would keep you at home, or you'd be so scared you wouldn't even want to go to school. Every day for weeks, that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the Frantz school surrounded by marshals, wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail. Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks, and as Ruby approached the school, she would see a crowd of people marching up and down the street, men and women and children shouting at her, pushing, trying to get to her, and the marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd, and she never said a word. She just walked really closely next to the marshal. The white people in the neighborhood decided not to send their children to school because Ruby was going there. So when Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Miss Hurley. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and learn with and to eat lunch with. So imagine, boys and girls, all the other children, not just in her class, but in the school, didn't come because Ruby went to school there. So she went by herself. Every day, Ruby would go into her classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite and she worked well at her desk, Miss Hurley said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or even scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I'd ever taught. So Ruby began to learn how to read and write in an empty classroom in an empty building with her teacher. Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said her teacher, Miss Hurley. How she went by those mobs and sat there all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed, comfortable, and excited to learn. Miss Hurley would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying, "I'm fine, Miss Hurley, I'm fine." The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she gradually began to wear down and get tired of coming to school by herself, or even decide that she no longer wanted to come to school, which a lot of us would. Then one morning, something happened. Miss Hurley stood by a window in her classroom, as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Now remember, each morning as she walked toward the school, Ruby showed courage when she walked through the angry crowd every day. She showed she was brave to go to school alone every day, and she was happy to learn. Oh, she had faith. She had faith in God and had strong faith that He would guide her. But this particular morning, Miss Hurley looked out the window, as she did, and she watched Ruby walk toward the school, and suddenly Ruby just stopped right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all the men and women, and she seemed to be talking to them. Well, Miss Hurley was curious because Ruby had never done that before. Miss Hurley saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered, what is Ruby saying today? Oh, and the crowd, they seemed to really want to hurt her. The marshals became frightened, and they tried to persuade Ruby to move along, and they tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby was not going to budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. Are you curious as what she said to the crowd? When she went into the classroom, Miss Hurley asked what had happened, and Miss Hurley told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised that she stopped because she never does that in the morning. And Ruby, for the first time, became a little irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, but I saw you talking, honey. I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for those people." Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was in the middle of the angry mob, and then she remembered she had to stop and pray for the people who were yelling at her, who were screaming at her. This reminds me of a story in the Bible. Jesus, He prayed for the people that hung Him on the cross. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. And after she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day. This is the prayer that she would say before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." At 6 years old, this little girl was shining for Jesus. She was showing others that her love for Jesus, and she wanted to be like Jesus. Wow, what a remarkable little girl. And so it wasn't long after that a law was made that children, black and white children, would go to the same school. So boys and girls, today, as you think about this story, I want you to think about how Ruby showed courage and bravery and faith and how she acted like Jesus. I hope you enjoyed that story. I think you're going to like our activity that we do next.